So this is a course in Marxian theory, and I want to lay out for you a little bit about who I am and how this is going to be organized. It's going to be quite intensive. I have 4 weeks, every Monday for 2 hours, for 4 weeks, to present a kind of condensed, intense version of what I think Marxian theory basically is like. That means that today I'm going to introduce Marxian theory, but particularly by distinguishing it from other kinds of theory, so that you can see what makes it the unique and different theory it is, and enable you, hopefully, to use Marxian theory alongside of or instead of other kinds of theory when trying to understand the world around you, say, for example, the current economic crisis. First, let me introduce myself so you know where this is coming from. I'm a professional economist. I went to the university and got my PhD to become a professor of economics, and I have been doing that for the last 30 years. Most of that time at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, from which I officially retired December of last year, and I now teach at the New School in Manhattan, New York City. In my capacity as an economist, I have had to learn both the conventional, often referred to as mainstream economic theories, and on my own, I learned the Marxian economic theory. I had to do it on my own because it's not part of the curriculum here in the United States. And a word about that is appropriate. In other societies, including many other capitalist societies, it is perfectly normal, usual, routine for people who are Marxists to lecture and teach courses in schools and universities alongside their non-Marxist colleagues. That is not the case here in the United States. The United States is afraid. As a society, it is afraid and has been for a very long time. So, for example, the majority of economics departments in the United States do not have any Marxists at all on the faculty. A few, in the interests of diversity or balance, get a token Marxist, a little bit like they would get a token woman, a token African American, etc. You get a token leftist, token Marxist. And there are some like that. And I myself have been that in a variety of situations. I was helped in my particular case, which is relevant here, because my education was at the what I consider the premier American universities. I went as an undergraduate to Harvard, then I went to Stanford to get a master's in economics, and then I went to Yale to finish my education, where I got another master's in economics, a master's in history, and a PhD in economics. So I am a loaded product of the best the United States has to offer. And apropos of a course in Marxian economics, let me explain that at no time when I was a student at Harvard or Stanford or Yale did any professor, with one exception, and he was the only Marxist there, no professor ever required me to read, with one exception, Marxism. Just didn't do it. If you ask these folks why, they would be awkward. There is really no explanation. The truth of it is, which they mostly wouldn't say, is that people my age, my colleagues, don't know Marxian economics. They're literally not qualified to teach it, partly because where they went to school, no one taught them. So where would they have learned it? They would have had to do it on their own, which is what I did. From an early age, partly because of my family and partly because of people that I sought out outside the university, I learned what this was about. I was given by kind professors who were friends in other departments or other universities. I was given books to read. They would occasionally meet with me to discuss it. Basically, I carved out my own curriculum because I wanted to learn it. But absent that desire and absent some people to help me, it would have been undoable. So I am in a peculiar position as a an older American professional economist, that I have had to develop in my life a competence in the conventional mainstream theories, because that's what they taught me in school. That's what they tested me on to get my PhD. And that's what I have to teach in many of the schools where I have worked in my life. That's my assignment. Go teach that material. So I know that, but I have also learned the Marxian alternative. My colleagues never had this opportunity. They know what they had to learn, like I did, but when I begin to talk, when I begin to present my analyses, they have no idea what I'm talking about. They either cannot participate in a conversation or make a kind of shorthand in which they are either hostile, because Marxism generates hostile feelings in people, or they are simple-minded. That is, they offer a kind of Marxism in discussions with me that's a bit of a caricature. It's like the difference between trying to talk to a literary professor about a great piece of English literature and having someone chime in who never did more than read the classic comic book about that novel or about that piece. And that's not a very interesting conversation after a few minutes. So that's been my experience. And so part of the rationale for this course, the whole idea of teaching this way, is to try in my own limited way to remedy the defect of American higher education. The fear in the United States about confronting, learning, and critically thinking about an alternative way of thinking. And let me give you a metaphor that I think captures this. If you were interested in understanding a family, say the family of a boyfriend or girlfriend that you had, or the family of a relative of yours, or the family of your neighbors, and you knew that there was mother and father and 3 children, and you began by saying, I'm going to ask the children what they think about this family. It'll be a way for me to learn about it. And you quickly discovered that one of the children, the first one you happen to encounter, loves their mother and father and just thinks that the family they grew up in was a blessing, was the best possible family they could have had, that nurtured and loved them and so forth. Would you seriously think about this person's evaluation of the family? For sure. They were a child. Children study their parents a lot more than we mostly recognize. And so such a child would have invaluable insights into and knowledge about that family. Now suppose you found out that one of the other 2 siblings didn't like the family, didn't feel nurtured, felt excluded, felt hurt, felt to be less loved than the others. Would you talk to that one also if your goal was to understand the dynamic of the family? Would you restrict yourself to a celebrant, or would you feel it was more appropriate to interview the one who celebrates, but also the one who criticizes? I think most reasonable people would answer that question by saying, of course. To get reliable insights, you should investigate both the observer who loved and the observer who didn't. The one who praises and the one who criticizes. You will then have to make up your own mind as to which is the more persuasive, or more likely you'll take a little bit of each one in composting together your particular idea. That would be the reasonable way to do economics too. The point of the story is this. Capitalism in Europe is about 200 to 300 years old. And from the beginning of capitalism's arrival on the scene, as it replaced the pre-existing system, feudalism, that existed in Europe, capitalism, like every other economic system human beings have ever lived in, has had the people who love it and has had the people who don't. That's normal, that's natural. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the midst of the successful emergence of capitalism in Europe. He's a product of modern capitalism as it took hold in the 19th century. He lived from 1818, when capitalism was really coming into Germany, to 1883, when capitalism had become the dominant economic system in that country. So he is a student of and a product of capitalism. But like many, he was a product who became critical. That is, his experience as a mature young person, and I'm going to describe him in a few minutes, was an experience of thinking and living in capitalism that led him, as it did many others, to be critical. And he developed an analysis of capitalism that was critical of it. He believed the human race could and should do better than capitalism. As I say, I'm going to explain it in a moment, but I want to get clear that he's critical, and that one of the key distinctions between Marxian economics and conventional economics is that the conventional economics fundamentally celebrates, applauds, and values capitalism. And Marx doesn't. They both study capitalism. A little footnote for those who may not be familiar with this. Marx never wrote a book about communism. Marx never wrote a book about socialism. He never wrote an article about either of these. That was not his interest. He felt that was looking into the future, which is not what he did. He was an analyst of capitalism. His books are about how the capitalist system works. But he never hid the fact that he was a critic who wanted to get beyond capitalism. And so he's like that sibling who's critical of that family, as opposed to the celebrants who aren't. Let me turn then to Marx as a particular figure, since this critical approach to capitalism is associated with his name. As I say, he was born in Germany in 1818, and as a young man, he came from middle-class parents, and so he did something that was very rare for German young people at that time. He went to college. Something like 1% of young people ever did that. Which was typical in Europe at that time. Mass education is a 20th century phenomenon, didn't exist in the 19th century anyway. In any case, he went to the university and he majored in philosophy. And he got the equivalent of a PhD, his doctorate in Germany, and his first job was as a young professor of philosophy at a German university. Because this was around the middle of the 1840s, it was a time when there were revolutionary changes, because capitalism coming in and contesting with feudalism produced lots of struggle in these societies. And particularly in 1848, there was a wave of revolutions. They're called the revolutions of 1848. They happened in every European country. Marx got caught up, as many young intellectuals in Germany did, in the revolutionary ferment, and this introduced him to critical thinking about German society, which he really hadn't encountered so much as a pretty pampered young student who studied Greek philosophy. His doctoral dissertation was on Epictetus, an ancient Greek philosopher. So he got caught up in political action, like many young people, and it really changed his way of thinking. He began to be less interested in philosophy, although he always remained interested, and focused himself instead on understanding the world as it was, what he called, and others at that time called, political economy. In those days, they didn't make rigid separations between economics over here and politics over there. That was thought to be artificial and unlike the way the world was. The world mixes everything together, so you mix politics and economics because they're always so intertwined. So everybody in those days called themselves, who studied these things, a political economist. That was what the name was given to what Adam Smith did, what David Ricardo did, and what Marx did. In his involvement, he came to the attention of the German police, whose job is always to keep an eye on this. And as he became more and more active, the German police did to him what they did to many young radicals. In those days, the appropriate thing was, you do not arrest these people, you do not jail these people, you do not injure these people, and you do not kill them. That's a more modern approach. In the old days, the solution was exile. What the German police did is they came to Marx's house one day and said, "We're taking you to the train station," which they did. And they put him on a train to Paris. Remember, Europe is a continent where the countries are relatively small and close together. So it's a very few hours and you're out of Germany and you're in France. When he arrived in Paris, the French police had received a communication from the German police. They met him at the train station and said, "We know you're a troublemaker, you can't stay here. We're putting you on a train to Brussels in Belgium," which is another 2-hour train, right? And so Marx, with his wife, went there, and the Belgian police repeated this happy thing, and they sent him to London. In those years, in the middle of the 19th century, London prided itself on never ejecting political refugees. People who came not because they had committed a crime or anything like that, but they were running away for political reasons or they had been exiled. So Marx joined a very large political refugee community in London, and he spent the rest of his life, which is most of his adult life, as a citizen speaking English in London, which is where he died. And he's buried in the Highgate Cemetery in London, and there's a big monument. If you want to go see it, that's where Karl Marx is buried. He didn't have much money as a political refugee, so for part of the years he lived in London, he was a paid reporter for a New York newspaper about the time of the American Civil War, and one of the most famous and interesting things Marx wrote was a series of articles in which he analyzed the Civil War in the United States, the role of slavery in the United States, brilliant articles that were very widely read and copied here in the United States because the readership of the New York World, which was the paper that hired him, was Americans. So Marx, by the way, was quite familiar with the United States, wrote for American audiences, and so on. He's not the alien that has sometimes been presented so as to create, again, more distance between them. What Marx did was remarkable. He gave up philosophy and began to study economics. And he studied it in a way that began with his political passion. He never denied it. He never imagined it's possible to separate your passions from the work you do, including the intellectual and analytical work you do. He felt the only honest thing to do if you were an analyst was to put your passion out there so people would know that that's part of what you're doing. The idea that anybody could do it without passion would be about equivalent in Marx's eyes to anyone doing it without breathing. That's not available. You stop breathing, you're not going to be an analyst very long, and you have no passion. It's not only that you're not going to do good analysis, you're not going to do any analysis at all, because passion is part of life. We all have passions, it's just some of us are comfortable or uncomfortable with them, and some of us are honest or dishonest about them. Marx put it right out there. He didn't like capitalism. He was going to develop a critical stance towards capitalism. And that made him very different from most of the economists whose work he studied to get himself up to speed to do economic analysis. A footnote here for some of you that may be interested. Unlike 99% of economists in the world, myself included, we have never taken the trouble that Marx took to write long, long studies of literally every major economist that had written before him. There is a 3-volume work Marx wrote that is published, available in English and many other languages, called Theories of Surplus Value. That's the title of the book. The Russian edition, because the Russians put out the most famous edition, runs 3 volumes. And all those 3 volumes are Marx's long, detailed, critical assessments of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and a whole host of the great writers before Marx, whom he studied, and you can see in what detail by reading them. As I say, the only other person that I know of in our profession that ever did that was a professor at Harvard years ago named Joseph Schumpeter. You may come across his name. He was very famous. He wrote a history of economic analysis. It's a book about 4 inches wide, an immense tone, but it's a testimony to that he did what Marx did. He was not a Marxist, by the way, but Marx is remarkable, and for people who are interested in how Marx came to develop his theories, he's basically done the work for us, because in those 3 volumes you can see how he worked his way. But why was he critical? Where did his passion come from? And this is important, because if you're going to understand Marxian theory, then you need to understand the passion that builds it, the passion that informs it, because that'll be part of your own assessment about your own feelings in relationship to this body of work. It's also a body of passion. He was part of a generation born in 1818 for whom the great historical event around which their whole formation as human beings occurred was the French Revolution. Recall the dates. The French Revolution erupts in 1789. That is only 20, 30 years before Marx is born. So Marx is born into the generation that was completely mesmerized, was drawn to the drama and the passion of the French Revolution. To remind you, the slogan of the French revolutionaries who overthrew King Louis, who overthrew the rule of the feudal landlords, who overthrew the role of the Catholic Church as the biggest landlord in feudal Europe. The slogans of the revolutionaries were liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And they brought in a revolution that was to get rid of everything in society that impeded or blocked the achievement of a human community grounded on, founded on liberty, equality, and brotherhood, without distinction of race, gender, or anything else. And Marx was absolutely caught up, as most of the young people of his generation were, with the nobility and the beauty of that image. The interesting thing was that the French Revolution also got rid of feudalism. It took the land away from the feudal landlords. It took the land and the buildings away from the Roman Catholic Church. It dispossessed the 2 great power institutions of feudalism, the landed nobility and the church. Instead, everybody became a buyer and a seller in the market. The powerful became the people who could amass moneyed wealth, not the people who were born into a noble family, not the people who grew up within the church hierarchy. Those people were actually marginalized or eliminated altogether. So the French Revolution was 2 things, if you think about it. On the one hand, the end of the feudal economic system and the emergence into dominance to this day of capitalism. But it was a transition from feudalism to capitalism that was wrapped in a noble, passionate commitment. And the best way to say it is this way. Feudalism has to give way to capitalism, the champions of capitalism said, because that's the way to bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood. We didn't have it under feudalism. If we get rid of those institutions, the feudal institutions, if we replace it with capitalism, where everybody has an equal chance to make money, build an enterprise, work for whoever is the best payer, each of us struggling, we can have a society of equally people where our rewards are proportionate to the effort we put out there. All of this kind of talk can be summarized in the view, the passionate view, that it's worthwhile to have, which it was, a violent revolution to bring modern France into existence. And remember, what was the country that copied the French Revolution? The United States. Copied it in the sense of copying the writings of Rousseau and the writings that led to the French Revolution, even though it happened a little bit later, but it was the same inspiration as the American Revolution. Both of these were violent events that were justified in the violent overthrow, in the case of France, of the old feudal regime, in the case of the United States, of the backward old royal regime of King George in England. The rationale, the justification, liberty, equality, and fraternity. That's why Thomas Jefferson writes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, etc. The same language, the same imagery as you had in the one place as the other. Capitalism would bring liberty, equality, and brotherhood. The promise of the American Revolution in the 1770s, the promise of the French Revolution in the 1780s. Now here comes the punchline. By 1818, which is 30 years later, Marx, who is as wonderfully in love with the image of liberty, equality, and fraternity as anybody ever was, believed in it all his life. He, however, reached a very important conclusion. Yes, the American, French, and other revolutions had successfully overthrown feudalism and brought in capitalism. But, and here comes the punchline, the promise that the transition to capitalism would also usher in liberty, equality, and fraternity had, in Marx's view, been broken. That promise was broken. Those things were not accompanying capitalism. On the contrary, as Marx looked around the exploding industrial capitalism of England and France and Germany in his lifetime, it was populated by super rich capitalists at one end and a mass of desperately poor workers coming in off the countryside, living in horrific housing. By the way, novelists in France, Émile Zola or Balzac in Germany, dozens in America, all over. There's endless evidence about this. Marx drew the conclusion, the problem, the slogan, the hope of the French Revolution is as compelling and as beautiful as ever. But the idea that capitalism was the vehicle to do that has proven to be mistaken. And therefore, Marx, talking about himself, said, I therefore devoted my life to trying to understand why capitalism has been, and as he came to believe, would forever be, unable to deliver liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that if you want those things, you have to go beyond capitalism. Capitalism is not the agency that will bring it. Capitalism is the obstacle to its realization. So if you want to understand the passion, it's the passion of the love for the ideals of the French and American revolutions, wedded in Marx to the facing up to the fact that capitalism hadn't been able to deliver what it was promised would be part of its benefits. And I must say, if someone asks me today, why are you a Marxist? My answer would be ditto. That I would look at the 150 years since Marx died, that capitalism has been around, and his conclusion that it failed to deliver liberty, equality, and fraternity, then all I can say is good understanding, because it hasn't been able to deliver it now either. The gap between rich and poor in the world today is greater, perhaps, than it has ever been. Whole continents, for example, Africa, sit in a condition that is unspeakable. The gap here in the United States between the rich and the poor, and I don't just mean in their wealth and their income, but their access to culture, their access to education, their access to school, medical care, it's grotesque. We have not produced liberty, equality, and fraternity. Nothing close to it. So it is important to understand that Marx's particular take in economics is driven by, is motivated by a sense that capitalism needs to be analyzed to understand why it hasn't been able to do what its proponents had hoped and promised in their enthusiasm. So it's not a dismissal out of some cheap shot of I don't like you, or I didn't make a lot of money, or it has nothing to do with that. The irony is, and part of the appeal of Marxism has always been to people who believe in liberty, equality, and fraternity because they feel a kindred spirit in Marx, and they're right. That was his motivation, and it led him to be a critic of capitalism. Let me turn then to how this criticism became in Marx a systematic theory. Because it's one thing to be critical of capitalism. For example, you can notice that rich and poor are widely separated, or you can notice that some people have a lot of power and others have very little, and things like that. Those are observations, those are valuable, but that's not a theory. That doesn't explain how and why capitalism should work like that, as opposed to how it had been promised it would work. So Marx began by saying, I want to see what everybody else has understood about economics. I want to learn from everybody who went before me, even recognizing that many of them, like capitalism, are not critical, but they, nonetheless, he did what I said at the beginning today. He did what you ought to do. You study everybody so you can understand the system. So if you read, for example, the theories of surplus value, you'll see Marx devoting hundreds of pages to analyzing the works of Adam Smith or David Ricardo, or countless people whose politics could not have been further from his own. And I ask you to compare that to modern-day non-Marxist and anti-Marxist professors of the sort who dominate the American university. They haven't a clue. It is embarrassing for me when I appear on panels with them, and go to conferences with them, which I do fairly often, that I really can't have a conversation one way or the other because they are simply unfamiliar with the Marxist literature. They never had anyone teach it to them in school. Their careers never rewarded learning this stuff. Indeed, it would have hampered their careers to be seen as interested in it, and so they simply do not know. A problem for them that is particularly acute now, that capitalism is having its second global breakdown in 75 years, when it would be really useful to know a little bit about criticisms of a system that is breaking down, rather than to be nothing but a cheerleader who therefore doesn't have much to say when your team is down 800-2. Okay. Here's how Marx went at it. He said that as I look at other theorists, and I look at how they examine capitalism, and how they come to see it and use their understanding to come up with explanations for what happens, to come up with proposals for what the government should do, and so on, that they have a very particular way of looking at the issue. And here, as Marx works this out, he draws heavily on his philosophical training, and in particular, his greatest teacher, the teacher who taught philosophy to the entire generation of his time, a famous German philosopher named Hegel, H-E-G-E-L. And he took from Hegel the idea that human thought is always, in a way, a struggle of people who see things differently. In other words, if you ask someone to explain the motion of the planets, or why plants grow, or why it rains under certain circumstances, if you look far and wide, you will quickly discover that there are multiple different theories around to explain that. And it's not surprising, because we're different, one person from the other, and we look at the world differently. We don't see the same things when we look at the world. I used to do a little experiment in my classroom where I would teach this to students, and I'll describe it to you now. I would ask students to please look around the room, the classroom where we were sitting, and write down on a piece of paper a paragraph with what they see. And then I would collect the pieces of paper, and I would begin reading to them. And very quickly, the class understood. We don't see the same things. One student would begin writing about the clothing that different people in the room were wearing. That's what they saw. Another one didn't say a word about clothing, was fixated on the architecture of the room, how it was designed, the shape. Another one didn't talk about the room or the other students, talked about me as the teacher. That was what they saw. Another one talked about expressions on people's face, but not me, or the architecture, or the clothing. In other words, to answer the question, what do you see, depends less on what there is and more on who you are. What in your life made you respond to my instruction? Tell me what you see by looking there. Moreover, if your mind is focused on clothing, you're going to not see architecture. It's not because it isn't there. And it's not even that you're not interested in architecture. It's just that you look in a certain way. The same thing happens when you try to ask people to explain what they think about less tangible things. I'll give you an example that may remind you of moments in your own life. The concept love. You're there with your significant other in a very dimly lit little restaurant having a wonderful conversation. And either you say to him or her, or she says to him, whatever, I love you. At which point a very difficult moment begins to develop. Because over the next few weeks and months, or if you're not careful, over the rest of your life, you're going to discover with that person that you don't mean the same thing with these two words, with this one word. Excuse me, you're two people. You each bring your unique ways of thinking, imagining, hoping, dreaming, analyzing to this concept. What he meant when he said it, and what you understood when you heard it, those are not the same thing. They can't be. You and that other person are completely different. You had different mothers and fathers, you grew up in a different community, you had different experiences. How in the world would you ever come to see things the same way? You don't. You can't. Therefore, human beings, particularly in large communities, always develop multiple different ways of understanding what's going on. Sometimes, one among the several ways that people have becomes so dominant that either everybody, for some peculiar reason, decides to think that way, or, what also sometimes happens, is that that one perspective represses or suppresses the others, punishes people who believe in some other way. You all know of examples when, for example, one concept of what God is kills people with a different concept. That's very popular and has been for a long time. So Marx begins as a student of Hegel with the presumption that, of course, different people will develop different economic theories. Just like it is no way strange that a family with 3 children will quickly discover that the 3 children don't have the same view of the family. They were not all born at the same time. They were born at different times. Mama and Papa were different people when each of them was born, except their actual experience of the family is different. So it'd be much more bizarre for them to have the same view, and much more suspect, than it would be for them to have a different view. But different views frighten a lot of people. Because if you live in a world of the sort many of you may live in, you believe without ever having questioned it, that if there are multiple ways of thinking about something, one of them is the right way and the other ones are the wrong way. That is a very deeply ingrained assumption in our culture. And it's one that Hegel didn't agree with, that Marx didn't agree with, and that I think if you worry about it a bit, you will probably not long agree with it either. Let me drive the point home as follows. First, suppose I asked you the question, what's the right way to eat a meal? Is it with a knife and fork, or is it with chopsticks? You would resent, I would guess, the question. You would say to me, what do you mean the right way? These are just different ways. They come out of different cultures, they have different qualities, it's a somewhat different experience to eat with a knife and fork as compared with chop. But the question, right or wrong, is the wrong question. It's like asking me which is heavier, Monday or Friday. You wouldn't spend a lot of time struggling with the answer because you think the question is nonsensical, right? And for a Hegelian or a Marxian, the question, what's the right theory, is similarly senseless. Theories are different. A Buddhist compared to a Catholic, we're not going to have a conversation which has got the right take on religion. They have different takes on religion. Okay, I would only ask you to apply the exact same logic if I say to you, look, there's a Marxist critical way of understanding capitalism, and there's a mainstream celebratory way. These are different theories, they develop in different ways, but if I ask you which one is right or wrong, my hope is that you would at least understand why a Marxist finds that question senseless. They're different. They come out of different needs, different feelings, different experiences. I already gave you some of the dimensions of Marx's life that ended up making him interested in a critical approach to capitalism as a system. With his critical approach, one of the things Marx focused on early in his life, and that came to shape his economics, was one particular aspect of capitalism that he found odious, that he found fundamentally incompatible with liberty, equality, and fraternity. Here's that dimension. It has to do with labor and work. In Marx's view, modern capitalist societies were structurally, constitutionally unable to provide equality, fraternity, and liberty because of the way they organized work. On the crudest and simplest level, one group of people worked very, very hard, and another group of people didn't work at all. On the other hand, another way of saying it, some people produced an awful lot more than they got, which enabled a whole lot of other people who didn't produce anything at all to live off that extra that those who worked produced. He noticed this because he noticed this as a jarring contradiction to liberty, equality, and fraternity. How are you going to have equality if some people spend all of their waking hours working and other people don't even have to think about it? How are you going to get liberty if some people, in order to survive, have to work like that? How much liberty do they have, and what does their liberty mean if they're too exhausted from so many hours of work and low pay for that work that they have neither the time nor the interest nor the energy to go out and inform themselves about civic affairs or participate in cultural activities, etc. So Marx, at an early age, became really interested in labor. And so his studies were shaped by an interest in the inequality, let's call it, of the whole way labor is organized. And eventually, it became a kind of hallmark of Marxist thinking about capitalism and about other systems, that he began to realize that not only was he interested in the organization of labor, but that other people who had studied economics weren't interested in it, hadn't studied. Let me again give you a metaphor. Suppose somebody was trying to study your family, and they used sociology, and they used biology and anatomy, and all different sciences to try to understand your family. And then along comes a man or a woman who says, wait a minute, there's something seriously missing. I mean, all these studies have learned things that are useful, but I immediately noticed there's something missing. And my name, just to play with it, my name is Sigmund Freud. And I have in my mind that in every one of our minds, there is a conscious part, that's what we're aware of, what we're aware of saying, thinking, and doing. But there's another part, a part that is unconscious, a part where we have sequestered off, put into a part of our minds that isn't available to us most of the time. Things we have experienced that are frightening to us. Something we said when we were a little kid and we saw the frown on our mother's face and we realized that's not a good thing to say. That's not a good thing to do. And so we wanted to please our mother, and so without knowing what we were doing because we were little, we put it in another part of our mind, kind of pushed it out of our daily consciousness. But it turns out, Freud argued, that every human being has an unconscious, and periodically that unconscious erupts into your conscious life. He gave examples. A slip of the tongue, when something comes out of your mouth that you didn't mean to say, but that's your unconscious talking. Dreams, another time when your unconscious can become semi-aware for you. Well, think of Marx like this. He's like Freud. What he brings to the analysis is not the new realm of life called the unconscious, called psychology, something which nowadays we all take for granted. You have to use psychology to understand the family, and we would think of ourselves as woefully inadequate if we excluded that or knew nothing about that. Well, Marx is saying to us, and I as a Marxist am saying to you, it is equally bizarre 150 years after Marx shows the importance of how labor is organized in shaping any society, that when you analyze capitalism today, or 50 years ago, or last month, most of the mainstream analysis does not worry about, look at, think about, or apply Marx's research on, and that of many Marxists since, the importance of the organization of labor in shaping how an economy works. Well, let me explain further. Marx wasn't interested when I say organization of labor. He wasn't interested in, the carpenter works with a hammer and the barber works with scissors. It's not that. He had a very particular idea of that part of labor that economists systematically ignored, at least all of those before he writes, all of those before, say, the 1850s. And the organization of labor he has in mind, this tool he's going to develop to analyze capitalism, he gives a very interesting name to: class. That is, he uses the word class to describe, to depict, to identify a particular organization of labor. And before I explain it to you, let me remind you that this is Marx's new and different concept of class. Because of course the word class, which comes from the verb to classify, to take a bunch of things and break them into little groups, to classify. For example, I could classify people in a room, those who are tall and those who are short, those who are fat, those who are thin. Those are classifications. The class of the fat, the class of the thin. Well, long ago, long before Marx, there were people who thought it might be interesting to classify people in a community between those who had a lot of wealth and those who had nothing, rich and poor, between those who wielded a lot of authority and power and those who didn't have any power. Those would be classes of rich and poor, classes of powerful and powerless. Those are interesting classifications. They're not what Marx had in mind. They're not the tool that is the central apparatus of Marx's theory. No, Marx had a different concept of class. And it refers to an organization of labor. And I'm now going to take you through that, and now we are really getting into the core concepts of Marx's distinctive way of analyzing capitalism. It begins with a basic idea, perhaps the most basic idea in all of Marx's analytical work. It goes like this. In every community of human beings, a household, a tribe, a clan, a village, a nation, no matter how big or small, in every reproducing community, one that lasts through time, you will find, Marx says, that some people in the community do work. And by this he means they apply their brains and their muscles to materials given by nature, a sheep, a tree, a flower, a plant. They transform the natural material into something useful for human consumption. They convert a tree into a chair, a sheep's wool into a shirt, an electronic system into a software program, whatever. And Marx says in every community, however, we need to notice that not all of the people in it are doing work. That is, some are working and some are not. And what's interesting, he says, is that it is always true that those who do the work produce an output of goods and services, shirts, chairs, software programs, whatever, that is larger than the quantity of those goods and services these workers themselves consume. In other words, if they're making food, they make more than they themselves eat. If they're making clothing, they make more than they themselves wear, and so forth. And now Marx says the other half of this story is that in every community there are people who do not work, who do not, in the sense I have been using it, apply their brains and muscles to producing the basic goods and services of this society. But they live, these non-workers, because the extra produced by those who work is distributed to them. Let me give you the simplest examples. Most human communities, not all, but most human communities do not expect small children to work. 1 year old, 2 years old, they don't work. But yet they are fed and clothed and housed. The only way a human being can consume, if he or she does not help to produce, is if somebody else is producing more than they get to keep and consume. That's the only way this can happen. Likewise, in many communities, old people, people determined to be beyond a certain age, are retired from work. They are allowed to continue to eat and wear outfits and keep warm and so forth. So they again have to be sustained by getting a distribution of whatever is left over from what the workers produce that they themselves don't consume. And now there are others. Sick people would be another one. Maybe people who are told, you don't have to produce goods and services, we want you to amuse us while we work. You don't make shirts and shoes and tables. You sing to those people who make shirts and suits and tables. Well, here's another one. We're afraid that people from over the hill will come and take our stuff. So we're going to have 3 or 4 people who stand around all day with a big stick to ward off those other people. Do they help produce the goods and services we all consume? Nope. And they have to be sustained. So Marx begins to develop an analysis, and it goes like this. Every human society generates a surplus. All that idea means is that the subpopulation, the portion of the population that works, always produces more than it itself consumes. And that more, that extra output beyond what the workers themselves get, that's what the word surplus means. That's what it designates. So in every society, Marx says, surpluses are produced and distributed. But now the punchline. It turns out, Marx says, 2 immediately important consequences come from this fundamental insight he has into human society. By the way, he's not arguing that this organization of surplus is more important than how people dance or sing or get married or do 1,000 other things. He's not saying, he's not ranking their importance. He would think that whole idea is silly. And if you ask, well, then why does Marx focus on that? He focuses on it because everybody else missed it. It's the same answer you'd give to why did Sigmund Freud focus on the unconscious? Did he think that other parts of life didn't count or didn't count as much as psychology? No. He focused on psychology because he wanted to add something to what people understood about the world, to offer a contribution that would help us understand more complexly, more subtly, more comprehensively than we had in the past. Marx is driven, but he also has the politics. He doesn't think people hadn't yet gotten to the issue of class. He thinks people were very scared of looking at class. Something which, by the way, Freud also covered. To this day, large numbers of people are very afraid of asking questions about their psychological processes for fear that that will uncover things about themselves or their family that frighten them. So Marx begins to look at the two aspects I want you to think about that come right out of this notion of surplus as being always produced. The first idea Marx has is how a society functions, its politics, its culture, its sexual relations, its personal interactions, its friendships, whatever, are going to be shaped by this. They're going to be shaped by, for example, deciding who's going to be among the people doing the work and who isn't. And how much of what those workers produce in the way of surplus is going to go to this kind of person who isn't working, as opposed to that kind of these questions of how you organize, they're going to shape everything else about that society. This is no minor matter. This is not about whether you pick your nose with your pinky or your index finger. This has major consequences. And the second thing Marx immediately noticed once he posed this question to himself is that societies have radically different ways of organizing this. Let me go back to my simplest example. There are some societies who do not feed their children. They don't. They don't have the workers produce a surplus to sustain their children. They don't want to. They don't care about it. They're not interested in the next generation. There are many famous examples in history where babies, when they were born, were simply left by the side of the road, the way people nowadays maybe leave kittens that their cat has had that they just do not accept responsibility for, and many of them died, as they often did. Likewise, there are societies that don't take care of their old people. They just don't. Or their sick people. In other words, every society has to make a decision. Who's going to do work? Who's going to produce the surplus, the workers? And who's going to get it? And how much are they going to get? Are we going to give our children a lot, but the old people a little? Are we going to give it reverse? Are we going to give neither of them a lot, but the people who run the society or the warriors who keep it, they're going to get a lot? All these decisions have to be made in every society. It's really only a question of whether we become conscious that we're doing that or whether it's all done blindly. Again, notice the parallel with Freud. We're still doing the things we do. All that psychology does is begin to make us aware of some of the motivations, some of the reasons why we do what we do. That's Marx's goal too. Not for the individual, but for the society. Okay. The fruit of this research led Marx to come up with a conclusion that will be actually our point of beginning, as it is the point of beginning of Marx's mature work in Capital when he analyzes capitalism systematically. And this end point of our discussion today, which is the beginning for where we will continue when we meet next, has to do with Marx's description of the 5 basic ways that human society has organized the production and distribution of surplus in human history. Marx not only argues that these were the 5 basic ways, But he argues that almost every society, when you look at it, has the coexistence at any moment of all of them. All that varies is the different proportions and the relationships among them. Okay, so let me now go through them, and you will see how it builds up to the foundation for an analysis of capitalism. He begins with the system he calls communism. Remember, I told you, Marx never wrote a book on communism. He never wrote an article on communism. It wasn't a topic he ever spent much time on. It's important that you understand that, because those who come later and who set up communist parties, communist governments, and so on, and who look for inspiration to Marx, are going to have, as they did, big problems, because Marx didn't write about it. Lenin had to start basically from scratch. He had Marx's critique of capitalism, and that was very useful. But nobody can find in Marx's work, and I've read it all, anything about socialism and communism in any kind of a sustained analysis. He didn't believe in that. He said that was looking into the future for him. He didn't believe in that. If you want that, he once made a joke, go talk to the person in the county fair who has the crystal ball. I don't do that. I analyze what I can see and what I experience in capitalism. So he begins, however, by saying this communism is different. One of the few times he talks about it, very briefly, that what communism is a society which does a very interesting thing. It takes some of its people and puts them to work. They do the work, grow the food, make the clothing, pots and pans, furniture, all the rest of it. They do that work, but they always produce, as we've already seen, more food, clothing, shelter than they themselves consume. So the first question of communism is, who gets that surplus? What happens to it? And Marx says the communist arrangement is for the people who produce the surplus to themselves get it. The producers of the surplus get it themselves, and they sit around and they decide what to do with it. In other words, the people who produce a surplus, who get a surplus, and who distribute the surplus socially are the same exact people. That was his definition of a communism. And you can see the root, commune, community. It's the community of workers who are also the ones who get the surplus and distribute it. Please notice, for those of you that are interested, that here is Marx's definition of communism. It does not have one word in it about the role of the state, because the role of the state is irrelevant to this issue. Communism is not about the state, for Marx. For other people it is, but not for Marx. For Marx, it's about how you organize the production and distribution of surplus, which is his entry point into analysis. The second kind, not communist, he tends to call by different names. Ancient is one name he gave it. Self-employed is a name I would give it. Here now, think of an individual farmer, craftsperson, someone doing work, who produces enough to sustain himself or herself as an individual worker, but always produces more. I'll give you an example. You do software programs in your garage with a computer. Do you produce just enough software programs so that you can sell them and get enough money to sustain your own consumption? If you did, you'd be out of business pretty quick. Why? You have to pay taxes to a government. Where are you going to get that from? You have to make sure that a little security service goes around your garage at night so you don't get the stuff stolen. Who's going to pay for that? You have to produce a surplus. You have to do more software than just your own consumption, because you've got other things to take care of, like a community that wanted to take care of its kids. You might also want to take care of your kids, to replace yourself when you wear out or die with another producer of software programs. And Marx says these two class structures, what he calls them, these two organizations of the surplus, have something in common. In both cases, the people who produce the surplus are the ones who get it and distribute it. In the communist case, it's the group of workers as a whole. In the ancient / self-employed, it's an individual worker. Now that takes care of two. Three are left. These three are distinguished from the first two, and I'll give you their names in a minute, by one key fundamental fact. In these three, the people who produce the surplus are not the same as the people who appropriate and distribute it. So there's, right away, a fundamental difference. Marx defines, in capitals, very clear, explicit. He defines any system in which the people who produce the surplus are different from the people who get it. He uses the word exploitation for that kind of a system. This is not about whether you treat people nicely or not, whether you pay them well or poorly. That's a popular usage of the term. That's fine. It's just not what Marx's definition was. Marx was fascinated by class structures, by systems in which you did not, the way you earlier added communism and the ancient, you did not give to the people who produced the surplus the social power and position of receiving and distributing the surplus they had produced. So let's now go through, in the time that remains, the three exploitative arrangements that Marx found in history. The first, slavery. A slave system, Marx explains. Remember, I told you he was a reporter for the New York newspaper during the American Civil War and wrote a very famous set of analytical essays on slavery and capitalism. In slavery, who does the work? The slave. The person who is required to raise the crops, make the food, make the shirts, and so forth, all of that. And if you know something about slavery, you will know that everything the slave produces is immediately and instantly the property of somebody else. There you can see Marx's gleam. Yeah, I got one. Here's a system in which the producers of the surplus, the slaves, produce much more than they themselves get. The master takes everything the slave produces, gives back to the slave what he feels like it, enough for the slave to survive, so this can keep going, but fundamentally, every bit of the extra, that what the slave produces above what he gets back, belongs to a different group of people, the masters. They get that surplus into their hands, and they distribute it. So that takes three systems: communism, ancient, and slave. Now the fourth, feudalism. In this system, the two types of people are the serfs, what they were called. A slave, I didn't mention this, but a slave, of course, I assume you know that, is not only does everything the slave produce belong to the master, but the slave himself belongs to the master, because that's what slavery means. It's a situation in which one human being can become the property of another. The serf is not a slave. He's nobody's slave. The serf is not a slave. The serf, particularly in European feudalism, but this system exists in many parts of the world at many times, the serf is tied to the land. And I'm going to use the example in Europe. For much of European feudalism, which was the dominant system for 1,000 years, from Russia in the east to Ireland in the west, and everywhere north and south, from Scandinavia to the tips of the Greek islands. The serf typically worked 3 days on land that was allocated to him. And during those 3 days, the serf worked on the land, and whatever he produced or she produced on that land was kept for their own consumption. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they went to the land of the Lord, the guy who owned the big piece of land that was the dominant character in this system. They were obliged to do that. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they worked on the land of the Lord. Everything that they produced there belonged to the Lord. At the end of work on Saturday, they went back to where they lived, where they worked the first days of the week. And Sunday, because European feudalism was capitalist, they rested and went to church. Okay? Now Marx said here is another exploitative system, because the time the worker, the serf works on the 3 days on his own piece, that's his, as Marx liked to use the phrase, necessary labor. That's the labor, the fruits of which he got himself to consume. It was those second 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that he was doing surplus labor. And that extra output, the output of those second 3 days, belonged instantly, automatically, to somebody else who wasn't the serf, the lord of the manor. So there's another exploitative system. Now, before I get to the last, the final one, capitalism, before I get to it, I want to already remind you of what we said earlier. You can see where Marx is going, right? You can see a man whose passion was to build a society premised on liberty, equality, and fraternity is noticing what? That it would be very hard to expect liberty, equality, and fraternity in a society where one group of people produced a surplus that another group of people got. What kind of equality is that going to permit? If you make a formal equality, we're all equal, but some of us work and produce a surplus that other one of us live off of, the equality is going to be unreal. It's going to be formal at best, phony at worst. That's, you can see where he's going. So now we get to capitalism, which is really where his theory starts. But before we get into the formal theory, which is next time, I want to take you through how Marx understood capitalism to be a distinctive and unique exploitative class structure. Like slavery and feudalism, in that the people who produced output produced a surplus they didn't get, but yet different from them in how it organized the whole arrangement. The difference of feudalism and slavery on the one hand and capitalism on the other is that in capitalism, the one who does the work is not a slave, he's nobody's property, and he's not a serf. He's not tied to the land, he's not tied to an individual. He is, in the language of capitalism, free, a free person. And he works. And the way he organizes work is not to be somebody's property like a slave, so the master says, slave, do this. Nor is it like a serf in which he works part of the time on his own piece, none of that. The way a worker works in capitalism is he enters into a labor contract, something which didn't exist in slavery, and it didn't exist in feudalism either. He enters into a formal agreement, often written down, in which he says, I will come and work for you, sir, a person, an employer, we call them. I will come at 8 o'clock and stay till 5 days a week, or whatever the specifics are, and that's what I will do. And in exchange, you will give me money. At the end of the week, you will give me money. I will come and I will use my brains and muscles 8 hours a day. I will work with whatever tools and equipment you give me. I will work on whatever raw materials you provide. And the fruits of my labor, the output that I have poured my creativity, my brains, my muscles, my very substance, that will be immediately and instantly your property. And I understand that if I take any of the output home with me at the end of the week, I get arrested. So you only have to give me a wage. I give you the fruits of my labor. Keep that in mind. The worker gives the employer the fruits of his labor. The employer gives the worker a wage. Now Marx does an analysis, which I will go through with you when we meet again. But I'm now going to do it in the simplest English I know, because it's important that the idea be set in your mind. To grasp this, put yourself in a position you've probably been in your life. You're looking for a job. You encounter an employer willing to discuss it with you, and you sit down with the employer and you discuss what you will be asked to do and the circumstances and the benefits, and you get sooner or later to that touchy issue, how much am I going to get paid? And let's assume you work something out, and just have round numbers, You agree to work, and the employer agrees to hire you for $20 an hour to come for 40 hours a week to do whatever it is this employer's business involves. You know what Marx is about to teach you. You already know. But you live in a culture which perhaps has prevented you from fully thinking about what I'm about to say. But you knew. Here's what you knew. There is no way on God's green earth that that employer is ever going to give you $20 an hour unless during that hour your labor activity produces more stuff for him to sell at the end of the week than $20 worth. If your hour only adds $20 to what he has to sell in his business, he would have to sell that product of your labor, get the $20, and give it to you, leaving him with nada. He's not going to do it. They never do. You're never going to have it. There's only one basis on which any capitalist ever hired a worker, and that condition is, you've got to produce more for me than I pay you for coming here to do it. And that difference is the surplus that all capitalist employees are required to do. You don't produce surplus, you don't work. And if that results in your death, have a nice day. So Marx is saying to us, recognize that capitalism, even though the workers are not slaves or serfs, does replicate those two systems in this particular way, that one group of people, the employees, go to work on condition that they produce a surplus that the employer gets and the employer distributes. Most work in capitalist societies today is done in an institution called a corporation. The workers in a corporation produce whatever the corporation sells. At the end of the week, when the corporation sells whatever it produces, it takes the revenue from the sale, and it uses it for three purposes. One, it replaces the tools, equipment, and raw materials used up this week. Two, it pays the workers a wage. Three, it has left over the surplus. Who gets that surplus? Who keeps that revenue? Who's the first one to get their hands on that portion of the revenue from sales that is not used to reproduce used up equipment and not used to pay the workers? The board of directors. That's who legally gets the surplus. And they then distribute it. Let me remind you, average size of a board of directors, 15 to 20 people, who can be receiving the surpluses produced by hundreds of thousands in large corporations, or any number in smaller. We have arranged capitalism so that it is an exploitative class structure, one that fundamentally, in the guts of the production system, creates a massive inequality and a massive tension. The tension between those who produce, and part of it they don't get, and those who get in proportion to how much they don't give to the people who produced it. That produces conflict, tension, corruption, and a whole host of other lovely consequences that together explain for Marx why the promise of capitalism to be the vehicle for bringing equality, fraternity, and liberty could not deliver ever on that promise. And Marx's implication, if you don't change the organization of this system of labor, if you don't get rid of the class structure and replace it with something else, the next century will see the same failures of realizing the dreams of the Russian, French, or American revolutions that the last century has. And that's the power of Marxian theory, because as we proceed, we're going to show exactly how capitalism works, starting with that surplus, so you can see in detail how it operates as an obstacle to achieving liberty, equality, and brotherhood. I will see you next week.